When the RMS Titanic set sail from Southampton in April 1912, it was billed as the epitome of luxury and technological achievement. A symbol of human progress, it promised safety, elegance, and the ability to conquer the ocean. But while the first-class passengers enjoyed luxury, extravagance, and a life of ease, those in third class, the ship's poorest passengers, faced conditions far from the glamorous image that Titanic projected. The third-class passengers, many of whom were immigrants seeking a better life in America, were housed in the lower decks of the ship, away from the grand dining rooms, suites, and first-class accommodations. They were kept in cramped and unsanitary conditions without the luxuries enjoyed by the wealthier passengers. The third-class quarters were divided into small cabins, some of which were shared by as many as 10 people, and they lacked the comfort and opulence that the wealthier classes took for granted. The smell of unwashed bodies, fumes from the engine, and the oppressive heat in the lower decks made life on Titanic unbearable for the third-class passengers. Despite these harsh conditions, the third-class passengers were still excited to be aboard what was considered the most luxurious ship of the time. For many, it was their first time aboard a ship of such grandeur, and they were hopeful for what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. Many had scraped together their savings for a chance at a new life in the United States, and aboard Titanic, they found themselves surrounded by other hopefuls who shared the same dream. However, this sense of excitement would soon turn to dread. On the night of April 14, 1912, disaster struck. Titanic collided with an iceberg, and within hours the unspeakable fate of the third-class passengers began to unfold. Unlike first-class passengers, who had immediate access to the lifeboats and were treated as the priority survivors, the third-class passengers were abandoned in the face of the disaster. In the aftermath of the collision, the third-class passengers were largely forgotten by the ship's officers. They were segregated, isolated, and ignored as the elite in the higher decks were given priority during the evacuation. When the alarm bells rang, warning passengers that the ship was sinking, many third-class passengers had to fight their way through locked gates, which were either blocked or shut to prevent them from reaching the lifeboats. They were often forced to wait in the lower decks, unaware of the disaster unfolding above them. The first-class passengers had access to the lifeboats and were among the first to be safely evacuated, while the third-class passengers were left to fend for themselves. The harsh reality for third-class passengers was that many of them never stood a chance. Unlike the wealthy passengers who had immediate access to the lifeboats, third-class passengers were treated as an afterthought. There were insufficient lifeboats for all passengers on the ship, and many were unaware of the lifeboat drills that had been conducted earlier in the voyage. The Titanic's crew, distracted by the chaos and panic, paid little attention to the plight of those in third class. The physical barriers on the lower decks meant that third-class passengers had to overcome significant obstacles in order to reach the lifeboats. Many were locked in, unable to get to the upper decks where the lifeboats were being launched. The lack of proper communication only worsened the situation. While the first-class passengers were notified of the need to evacuate, third-class passengers were left in the dark, struggling to understand the situation. The psychological toll was also immense. The third-class passengers, already isolated from the rest of the ship's passengers, were now abandoned and left to perish in the cold waters of the Atlantic. Many mothers, unable to protect their children, were forced to watch them die in the freezing waters. Fathers tried desperately to fight for their family's survival, but the overwhelming odds meant that few survived. When Titanic finally sank at 2:20 a.m., only a fraction of the third-class passengers were able to escape. Most were trapped in the lower decks with no chance of survival. Of the more than 700 third-class passengers on board, only about 170 survived. The rest drowned in the freezing cold waters, their cries unheard amidst the chaos of the disaster. The story of the third-class passengers is one of tragic abandonment and discrimination. These individuals, who had set sail aboard the Titanic with dreams of a better life, were left to die without help or mercy. Their fate stands as a stark contrast to the treatment of the first-class passengers, who were given priority and access to lifeboats as they raced to escape the doomed ship. As the Titanic collided with the iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912, the atmosphere on the ship shifted from luxury and excitement to panic and chaos. While first-class passengers were relatively sheltered and received prompt warnings about the disaster, the fate of the third-class passengers took a far darker turn. Isolated, locked away below deck, and largely ignored during the crisis, they faced a harrowing reality as the ship sank beneath their feet. When the order to abandon ship was finally given, many third-class passengers were trapped below decks. The lower levels of Titanic were separated by locked gates, and the third-class passengers had to navigate their way through pitch-black corridors, fighting their way through barriers and panic-stricken crowds. Chaos swept through the lower levels as people realized the ship was sinking. However, many were still in the dark about the true extent of the disaster. The third-class quarters were already poorly lit and lacked sufficient escape routes, forcing families to search in desperation for a way out. As the water flooded the lower decks, panic spread rapidly among those who had no idea how to escape. Those who were fortunate enough to get to the deck were faced with a horrifying reality. The lifeboats that had been lowered into the sea were already filled to capacity, and many were now pulling away from the ship's side, leaving behind hundreds of people who had no way of getting off Titanic. In the confusion, women and children who were supposed to be prioritized were often left behind as the desperate scramble for the lifeboats escalated. Many third-class women, unable to make it to the lifeboats in time, were left to drown in the icy waters of the Atlantic. Mothers and children were among the most vulnerable, unable to escape the fate that awaited them. Unlike the first-class passengers, who were guided by crew members to the lifeboats and given priority boarding, third-class passengers were often met with closed doors, blocked passageways, and a lack of clear direction. The ship's officers did not prioritize their evacuation, and this negligence meant that many third-class families were either locked in the lower decks or left to wait in the cold and chaos, unable to reach the boats. The unforgivable truth was that class disparity directly impacted who lived and who died. The third-class passengers, already enduring harsh conditions, faced an even more brutal and tragic fate as the Titanic sank. The lifeboat shortage was another devastating blow. Only half of the ship's lifeboats were filled to capacity, and many lifeboats were lowered while they were still only partially filled. This was due to a combination of confusion, panic, and class-based favoritism. There were reports of chaos and violence during the evacuation, with third-class passengers being pushed aside by first-class passengers and crew members who were doing everything they could to secure their spots in the lifeboats. The lack of consideration for third-class passengers meant that their chances of survival were slim. As the ship began its final descent, the Titanic's officers began to prioritize the elite, leaving the third-class passengers to face certain death. In the freezing Atlantic waters, the tragedy was not over. For those who jumped or were thrown into the sea, the immense cold was another obstacle to survival. The lifeboats that were lowered were often too few and too far apart, and many of them couldn't reach the passengers who had fallen into the water. Those who remained on board the Titanic faced the horror of the ship sinking, knowing that there was no way out. In the final moments of Titanic's descent, those who remained below deck, the majority of whom were third-class passengers, were essentially abandoned. As the stern of the ship rose into the air, people were crushed beneath the weight of the ship as it finally sank to the ocean floor. The unspeakable horror faced by these third-class passengers was made all the worse by their invisibility in the eyes of the crew and higher-class passengers. They were denied the dignity of a fair chance to survive. They were seen as expendable, and their chances of survival were incredibly low. In total, over 700 third-class passengers boarded Titanic, but only around 170 survived. The rest were lost to the icy waters of the Atlantic. Many of those who survived suffered psychological scars for the rest of their lives, haunted by the trauma of the desperate struggle to survive, witnessing the drowning of loved ones, and being ignored by those in charge of their survival. The legacy of the third-class passengers is one of tragic neglect and class-based cruelty. The fact that third-class passengers were treated with such disregard speaks volumes about the hierarchical system that permeated not just Titanic, but society at large during the early 20th century. These passengers who had embarked on Titanic with hopes for a better future were cruelly denied the opportunity to escape the horrors of the sinking. Their suffering was compounded by the fact that they were left behind, abandoned by a system that valued wealth and class over human life.